with Cuba, it's very unique in the sense that there's a lot of food scarcity there and it's across the whole population.
Hmm.
So I think the messaging is just like eat enough and eat now because you don't know when there will be food again,
Yeah.
which leads to some trouble with people's relationship with food.
Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. I am your host, Arely Gutierrez. As a first-gen Mexican American, and especially now working as a dietitian, I have seen firsthand how a lack of cultural inclusion can negatively impact our patients. And I want to help change that. So I started Food Culture Curious to have impactful conversations with healthcare professionals of different cultures and backgrounds to get their insight on how to be more culturally inclusive in our nutrition recommendations. Let's continue this journey together with today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. My name is Arely. I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to help healthcare professionals be more culturally inclusive in their nutrition recommendations. Today we have with us Diana Mesa, RDN, LDN, CDCES. She is a bilingual dietitian, diabetes educator, and the owner of En La Mesa Nutrition, a private practice specializing in diabetes, PCOS, eating disorders, and she works across 27 states. Diana is also a sought-after media dietitian, recipe developer, and consultant. Thank you for being with us, Diana.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, I can't wait to learn all about your cultural foods and everything that you're doing. I'm just so excited.
Thank you. Me too.
Perfect. Well, let's jump right into it. Tell our listeners a little bit about your cultural foods, specifically getting us familiar with those staples, right? The protein, the starches, and the produce.
Definitely. So I was born in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba, and I came to Miami when I was 4. So my food culture is very much focused on Latin Caribbean cuisine, if you will. And so that's obviously going to include the arroz, white rice specifically, a lot of plantain, so plátano maduro frito or tostones, so sweet plantain or the savory ones. And then when it comes to the proteins, we love our beans. We also love the typical animal proteins. I mean, lechon is going to be a big one in Cuba for the holidays. And I have found fun and interesting and other cultural ways to prepare it that aren't my own so that I don't get bored of it. But we also do a lot of beef and fish, a lot of fish, a lot of mariscos, a lot of shrimp, camarones, being in the Caribbean, we have so much access to these waters that we can fish. And my favorite one is pargo or snapper. And I love a good whole fried snapper. But we also do a lot of viandas in terms of like starches. And viandas, I know, can have different meanings in different Latin American countries. But in Cuba, we're talking about potatoes, yuca, malanga, ñame, boniato's another one. So yeah, we do a lot of starches there too.
Awesome. Some of those last ones, are you able to find them here in the US? Maybe I'm just not familiar with the
With the
word.
name.
Yeah.
So yeah, so malanga you might find as taro.
Okay.
And I think it might be a different variety than maybe the one that we get in Cuba or here. At least here in South Florida, they are very accessible because they're enjoyed throughout the Caribbean. And here we have a lot of Caribbean people, obviously, because of proximity, right? But malanga might be known as taro. Ñame, ooh, that's a good question. I know boniato can be maybe like a white sweet potato. It depends.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
there's a lot.
it's funny that even in Spanish, we'll have different names for the same items. So it's especially hard to translate from English to Spanish and then talking to patients of different cultures. Someone can ask me, right, as a Mexican American, oh, well, tell them, beans, so and so. Okay, frijoles. And they're like, habichuelas. Like they might call it, something else.
Caraotas.
Yeah, yeah.
Venezuelans call black beans caraotas, and that to me was like, wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny we have all these different
Oh.
names. Perfect. So thank you for sharing about the staples. Can you tell us a little bit about your traditional holidays and what foods and drinks you see around these times?
Absolutely. So one thing that we celebrate a lot just in my family is Nochebuena and El Día de los Reyes Magos. And so these are more Christianity-based holidays that are celebrated in my culture, but even moving to the more secular now and day, my family's not very religious, but we still keep that tradition of Nochebuena and Reyes Magos alive, especially when I was a kid. So for Nochebuena, Latinos in general, I think, celebrate on the 24th instead of the 25th when it comes to Christmas. And so Nochebuena tends to involve the typical kind of spread, the Cuban spread. It's going to be a roast whole pork. And a few years ago, it was our turn. Like we got passed down the responsibility. So we hosted in our house. And here in Miami, it's got its own culture, but in Cuba, if you're lucky to come across a whole pig to roast for the family, you may be digging a hole, like a pit in the ground, and it's called lechon en púa. So it's kind of similar to how they prepare it in Hawaii. So there's some indigenous roots to that kind of preparation where
Mhm.
you dig a hole, you cook it over a pit for many, many hours. And so it's kind of like a labor of love where all the men in the family take turns tending to the pig, drinking their beer and their whiskey and rotating the pig until it's nice and done. That is a pretty popular one. Then we have the accompaniments, right? We have the yuca con mojo. Yuca is cassava, and mojo is our own sort of dressing that is based with garlic, oregano, sour orange, and or lime. And everybody has their own version of that, but that's the general theme of it. And our congri, which is depending on where you are, it may look different. So it's typically a mix of beans and rice. Like I said, it depends on who you ask, but traditionally, black beans and rice are called moros, and congri is red beans and rice. If you're on the east side of the island, you're gonna see congri with red beans. It depends though, because you
Yeah.
might say congri and you might get black beans. So, you might want to specify.
Yeah. There's regional differences, of course.
A
Yes.
lot, and not just on how the dish is made, but on what it's called too.
Yeah, I think I want to say I was in Florida and I went to a Cuban restaurant for the first time. And that was the first time I tried congri, and it was the black beans with the white rice.
There you go. Perfect
Yeah.
example that, the proper name for that might be moro, but
Hmm.
people call it congri and it's just kind of stuck.
Yeah, they're like beans and rice, some type of beans and rice.
Exactly.
Perfect. Do you have any traditions surrounding New Year's as far as I'll tell you mine. Right when the clock strikes midnight, we have 12 grapes, like one every second to make a wish on. So this year we were in North Carolina with our friends, and really nobody else there was Latino. So it was just me and my husband with our grapes, and everyone's like, "What do you have grapes for?" I'm like, "Oh, because you need to make your wishes." And they're like, "Okay."
Oh, goodness. You know that I thought that everybody did that?
Yeah.
I thought that that was a New Year's thing, but that's so interesting because we do the same thing, but because we're here, like so steeped in our culture, everybody around us kind of does the 12 grapes thing, and I didn't realize it wasn't practiced across all cultures. Yeah, we do that too. Cubans have a lot of little interesting habits. For example, we will take luggage around the block, and that's supposed to bring us a lot of travel. Another thing is that if you wear red underwear, it's going to give you a lot of, love for the year. And then another practice is to dress in white because that symbolizes a new start for the year. Oh, I know a good one. You throw salt over your your shoulder to kind of like scare away any bad luck or bad spirits, bad juju that might be looming over you.
Oh, that's awesome. We throw lentejas. Yeah.
How funny.
Hmm.
I love that. I love these
Yeah.
little practices.
Yeah. Yeah. The traditions. So, have you ever noticed in the Cuban culture that there's any cultural health beliefs? I like to think of it as like wisdom that's been passed down through the generations that maybe isn't evidence-based yet. but it's something that we keep in our culture for when someone's either feeling sick or just the foods that, are supposed to promote health.
Yeah. So with in Cuba, we have a lot of ethno-medicine because obviously we've got a lot of African and indigenous influence and wisdom in the culture that gets passed down. And so there's so many herbs and things. I mean, everything from basil for chest congestion and cough to moringa. And people grow these kinds of things in their backyard too, because obviously there's a lot of scarcity in Cuba, and all people have sometimes is their local garden in their yard, And I mean, the list is very long of foods and herbs that are protective and supportive. And then a lot of them have weird names that I don't even know.
You just kind of know what it looks like and when to use it.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, no. I've heard about moringa. I know that they like to use it, especially if someone has diabetes, the cultural practices that it's supposed to help with your blood sugar. So I hear about moringa a lot.
Oh, you know what? Another one that I grew up with a lot is tilo, té de tilo.
Okay.
Linden, I think it is. And that one is used like if you got scared or if you are stressed out or if you need to sleep, abuelita will make a té de tilo so that you can like sip on it and calm down?
Mm. It has like soothing properties.
Exactly.
Those are some great examples. Yeah.
Yeah, the list is long. With Cuba, it's very unique in the sense that there's a lot of food scarcity there and it's across the whole population.
Hmm.
So I think the messaging is just like eat enough and eat now because you don't know when there will be food again,
Yeah.
which leads to some trouble with people's relationship with food, especially when they come to the United States and suddenly there's an abundance of everything. But yeah, I digress.
No, I would actually love to hear more about that. Talk to us a little bit about challenges that the Cuban population faces, either in Cuba or the Cuban Americans.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Cuba, the challenges are endless, right? And I don't want to get emotional because I will. So let me take a second. You might want to edit this out.
No, no, it's okay. This is something that's very important to us.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of scarcity in Cuba. There's scarcity in medications, there's scarcity in food. There's just not a lot of anything there. So, what there is what there is, and you have to wait long lines. They give you like una libreta, like a little booklet with your basic, and I put that in quotation marks, basic necessities, because a lot of times it's not even enough for one person, let alone a whole family. So, with that said, there's obviously a lot of food insecurity, a lot of malnutrition, nutrient deficiencies. My sister and nephew still live there, but their experience in Cuba is quite unique compared to the rest of the people because she's a scientist there, and so it's not the same. I personally believe, and I don't know that there's a lot of literature on this, but might be worth doing some investigating, that part of the reason why 6% of Cubans in the United States have diabetes, which is a pretty high number, I think part of that, apart from all of the generational trauma that growing up in scarcity causes, there's also just the fact that food insecurity is a risk factor for things like diabetes. And so when we come to the United States, there's an abundance of foods. Obviously, a lot of them, especially the more affordable ones, may not be the most nutrient dense. They may be very energy dense, very palatable. And imagine when you don't have much to eat, you are going to gravitate to those things. And then on top of that, just the stress of being a Latino in the United States, a lot of things add up to the risk of developing diabetes and the fact that 6% of Cubans here in America have diabetes. So I think it's multifactorial, obviously, but the food insecurity piece is a big one.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, for the Cuban Americans here, I'm sure it must be difficult, like now that you have access to food and the portions here are always pretty big, to honor your hunger cues because you might be full, but how guilty do you feel throwing away the rest of the food? You know,
Yeah.
I
And
still
it's
feel like
hard.
that.
Yeah, same,
Yeah.
especially like when I go out. That's the Clean Plate Club is a really big thing for the people that I work with who are from Cuba. I mean, and other countries too, right? But
Yeah.
growing up and still today, even when I go out to eat, I have to really make a mindful, conscious effort that it's okay. I don't have to clean my plate. There will be food later. And especially if you're growing up in those conditions as a child, like your formative years in food insecurity, then that can really, really impact the way that you behave around food.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I remember I went to dinner with a friend who grew up in a different bracket than I did, right? He ordered a dish, didn't like it, didn't touch it. Was like, no, you can throw it away. And I was like, are you serious? Like I can take it home. Like you don't need to throw the whole dish away. Like I'll take it. Because I was so used to like you don't throw away food, like you don't
Hmm.
waste food. That can feed you for another 3 days.
Hmm.
So I was
Even if you
like,
don't like it, you don't have the luxury of not liking it. You eat it or you're hungry.
hmm. Hmm. So I can see how it would
Yeah.
affect them. What are some other challenges? I know you specifically focus on diabetes, right? Your CDCES. What made you want to focus specifically on diabetes and how do you help your population?
Yeah. So I didn't really know that I wanted to specialize in diabetes, but my father has diabetes and my grandmother, his mother had diabetes. And so it's always been near and dear in my life. And in 2020, I started working at a clinic in the community called Sanitas, and they deal with people with diabetes. It's like a primary care clinic or a specialty clinic where you can get everything done from labs to x-rays to see the dietitian. And their insurance, the one that they were working with, only covered diabetes related diagnoses. So suddenly I was working with a lot of Latinos with diabetes. And
Mhm.
I was like, oh, okay. Wow, I'm seeing some patterns here. I really enjoy working with people with diabetes because nutrition is something that really can make a big impact in these people's lives. And the fact that it impacts our communities in general at such a high rate felt like this is something worth focusing on, right? There's a lack of resources out there for people that eat the foods that we eat. There is a lot of misinformation on the impact of the foods that we eat on our blood sugar. And I was like, I think this might be worth devoting my life to so
Yeah.
that we can really make some changes and improve those numbers. And yeah, it was kind of history after that. And that is where I started studying to become a CDCES and where I got my experience to be a CDCES. And then, my mentor at the time, she was a CDCES, also a Latina, Lorena Drago. She wrote, can't remember the name of the book, I'm sorry,
Mhm.
but the ADA picked it up and it was like more than rice and beans or something like that, like
Mhm.
Latino nutrition for diabetes back in the day, right? And those resources aren't really always readily available, especially if they are a little bit older. So created an ebook, not just for my patients, but also for other practitioners who wanted to see examples of what a diabetes plate, the way that we have it here, might look like with our cultural foods from Latin America. And that did really well. And so it was just kind of like a snowball.
Snowballed, yes.
Yeah, it snowballed. And then just to overlap that, it wasn't just diabetes. I didn't think about eating disorders at all when I was in school, but the people that I was working with that had diabetes, that are being told all of these things about their body size, the foods that they're eating, it became so restrictive. So many of them had disordered eating. Some of them most likely had eating disorders that weren't even diagnosed. So then that was kind of a natural niche. I didn't even look for it, it just found me.
Yeah. Yeah, you found your calling. I can definitely relate to that, especially working as a kidney dietitian and seeing how many Hispanic patients, because either diabetes or hypertension, end up on dialysis or end up with CKD. And there are such few Spanish speaking Latina dietitians that can understand their culture, that can even communicate to them,
Who even
communicate with
understand
them.
kidney disease,
Yeah. I felt like that. I was like, so this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life because there's just such a need. Like it's a calling and it almost feels like a duty. Like, if not me, then who?
right?
Mhm.
Exactly.
I'm so glad that you found your calling and that we have someone that can help.
Me too, about your calling. Like I said, I'm going to refer a lot of people to you because we need you.
Mm. We need each other.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about if there's any, healthcare professionals listening and they want to be better about working with the Latino population, the Cuban population that either has diabetes or eating disorder, whichever you'd prefer to talk about, or both? How can they be better? How can they be more culturally inclusive?
Yeah, I think the recommendations that I would give probably overlap for both. I would say stop focusing so much on body size and focus more on those health supporting behaviors. As we know, we have different beauty standards than the traditional Western beauty standards. And so the focus on body size is sometimes also not only is it harmful, but not really that science based. It's also just doesn't resonate with us a lot of times because we have different beauty standards. Let's not focus on weight, please, across the board. The next one would probably be get curious. Get curious about what people are doing. Just because somebody's Cuban doesn't mean they eat congri, right? So, in the same way that we try to be really culturally responsive by understanding cultural foods, let's also not make the assumption that just because somebody is from somewhere, they're eating those foods or solely those foods, right? There's acculturation at play. Maybe they married somebody from a different culture and they eat their cultural foods, you know? So get curious and, make them feel welcome. I think Cubans are very warm people. We are very touchy-feely, like personal space is not a thing. There's a lot of body language and eye contact and just being able to touch your shoulder. Those kinds of things are very common for Cubans and Caribbeans. And so, one of the complaints that I used to hear the most at the diabetes clinic is like, everything is so cold here. Like, the doctor doesn't even palpate me anymore. So, if you have that rapport with somebody who is from my culture, it's okay to put your hand on their shoulder and like give them a pat. Like, that makes us feel
Cared
brought in
about.
like a hug.
I know. It's funny. It's something that I notice from people who are of Latin culture, right? We're a lot, like you mentioned, touchy-feely. And it just instantly makes you feel like this person sees me, this person
Yeah,
cares about me. And yeah, I guess that's a cultural thing, like you said.
absolutely.
There's a couple of things that you mentioned that I wanted to respond to. I really like how you said that we really need to shift the focus away from body size because I feel like so many things get missed or misdiagnosed because of body size. You end up having diagnoses that could have been caught if you were just weren't focused on the weight, right?
Yeah,
Or eating disorders, like you mentioned, going missed because, oh, how can they have an eating disorder? They're overweight. Obviously, they're eating enough, or malnutrition that doesn't get diagnosed because, oh, they have a high BMI. They're not malnourished, even though they lost, 50 pounds in the past 6 months unintentionally.
right.
So I just love that you mentioned that. And as far as like not making assumptions, I very much support that. And I know we all do it sometimes unintentionally, but just to be aware because even I've done it. It wasn't in a clinical setting, thank God. But there was this one time I was meeting my husband's coworker and he was Asian. And I was like, oh, so, where are you from? Because he said, I just moved to Texas. I'm like, oh, where are you from? He's like, well, before this, I was in New York and I just really miss like the foods of my home country. And I was like, oh, my my response was, oh, in Houston, we have a really great like Chinatown. We have like Asia Town, like anything, Korean, Japanese. We have all the things. And he was like, well, that's great, but my home country is Brazil. Like,
Oh,
and I was like,
oops.
oh. Yeah, oops. Like
Yeah. And
I
we're
made a
well-meaning,
yeah,
but it goes to show how deeply internalized those biases are. And they're not like bad or anything. Not in your case. There can be bad biases, but
yeah. But just
yeah,
something to keep in mind, to be aware, like just because they come from even if they come from a certain culture, they might not eat that type of cultural food. They might be
exactly.
third generation and no longer eat the traditional foods. It just depends.
Yeah, maybe they're allergic to something. Maybe they're like me. I'm Cuban, but I don't drink coffee. And people are like, "What?"
Yeah.
Yeah, it just doesn't jive with me. I prefer matcha.
Yeah, I'm
But
I'm Mexican and I don't like cilantro. Like
there you go. And That's a really good point that I just want to also highlight. Latinos are such a diverse group of people that you can have somebody who presents like, with Asian features and heritage, but is from Brazil or is from Ecuador or anywhere else and is from Cuba. We have a lot of Chinese Cubans.
Yes, exactly. Because we forget all the different movements and patterns of migration over time. Like there's a name for the Japanese food that comes from
Nikkei.
America. Yes, yes. So that entire fusion, you know. But that's why I like having this podcast so we can make people just be a little bit more aware. They can
Absolutely.
do just a little bit better.
I love that. And like nobody's perfect and it is okay.
Mhm.
And if we mess up, we show humility and we do better. And we
Yeah.
don't expect anybody to know everything about everything. It's impossible. Not
Mhm.
even I know everything about Cuba and I was born there. And so yeah, you just can't know everything and that's okay. But if you lead with curiosity and excitement, and interest, genuine interest, people pick up on that. And especially from my culture, we're more than willing to share.
Beautiful. Diana, before I leave you, is there a story that stands out about a patient that you've been able to help either dispel any myths or just help them include their cultural foods while still achieving their health goals?
So many. I mean, where do I start? I mean, I'll tell you, they're not patients of mine, but the guys working here in construction at my house, this just kind of popped up. They asked me what I do for work. I told them I'm a dietitian. They're Dominican, right? And so I'm like, oh, great. So Caribbeans, we eat very, very similar things with some differences and different names and stuff. And so they were kind of curious. They were like, oh, bueno, yo tengo la presión alta, tengo el colesterol alto, los triglicéridos, so for non-Spanish speakers, they got blood pressure issues, high triglycerides and cholesterol. And so we started kind of talking there about all the different foods that they can include that they're already eating. We were talking about eating auyama, which is calabaza in my country. And so we were talking about how all of those fibers in those root vegetables, in the plátano, in the auyama, they're going to have a lot of those fibers that are going to help with their cholesterol. And so we talked about all of those things. He was like, me dijeron que los huevos son malos. So he had some misconceptions about eggs, and we were able to
Mhm.
clarify that. He was also under the impression that eating bread was bad. So we were able to clarify that it's not. And we talked about how while he may be receiving this information from his doctor, doctors aren't the best source of nutrition information. And that's why we exist. And so I gave him a little nutrition session on the fly there, but they seemed really excited about the possibility of being able to eat those cultural foods and them being good for them, unlike they're being told in places that they go.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate. And it happens a lot with everything, weight loss, diabetes, CKD. You just get all of this misinformation. And unfortunately, a lot of it is stripping away those cultural foods that are so important. You see the joy in their face when they know that they can have them and still achieve those goals.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Diana. I'm so sorry you lost your power, but thank you for jumping back on. I want people to be able to find you if they want to work with you. How can they work with you?
Yeah, they can visit me at www.enlamesanutrition.com. You can book a discovery call. It's a complimentary 15-minute discovery call. We accept insurance, so you'll be able to submit your insurance information. We'll verify those benefits before our discovery call so that you know if you're covered or not. And you can also find me on Instagram. I'm often yapping on there about diabetes, cultural foods, relationship to food and body. And so you can find me at En La Mesa Nutrition there as well.
Perfect. And what a wonderful name for your practice.
It's almost like fate, right? If my
Yeah.
last name would have been, I don't know, Fernandez, it would have not worked out. But it's Mesa, so it means so many things, right? We can have a seat at the table. So many things happen in la mesa.
Yeah.
Sobre mesa, that little time after a meal where we're chatting. And so I really appreciate it. And actually, my preceptor was the one who gave me the idea for that name. So shout out to her for that.
Lorena, right?
No, my preceptor for my internship, her name was
Oh,
Alex Courtwright. She's Mexicana Irish.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
How fun. Thank you again so much, Diana, and I hope we get to catch up again soon.
Thank you, Areli. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
No, of course. All right, everyone. We'll catch y'all next time. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/food culture curious. Or as always, you can support by sharing, following, or rating this podcast. Every click from y'all means the world to me. And now for a quick disclaimer. Food Culture Curious is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not take the place of medical advice from licensed healthcare professionals. If you need to seek medical advice, please speak to your healthcare provider. Thank you for listening.